Our work is made that much more urgent because at the end of this year, we face a series of deadlines that require us to make major decisions about how to pay our deficit down. Decisions that will have a huge impact on the economy and the middle class, both now and in the future. Last year, I worked with Democrats and Republicans to cut $1 trillion worth of spending that we just couldn't afford. I intend to work with both parties to do more, and that includes making reforms.
In just a few weeks, the United States government will face the fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff is the arbitrary decision point agreed upon by the United States Congress in August 2011, when $1.2 trillion will be automatically slashed from the federal budget. According to economists, politicians, and those who believe them, putting the congressional authority of Article 1, Section 8 on cruise control will not only reduce the federal deficit, but also reduce employment by at least 2 million people, reduce the overall economy by 0.5%, and reduce the funding to over 1,000 government programs. But after all, we learned from the presidential campaign that the U.S. economy and the federal budget should be handled like a business. And when debts and expenses get too high, you cut costs, lay off some workers and their health care coverage, and work toward the bottom line. Without a Glass-Steagall firewall immediately put in place by the U.S. Congress in the lame duck session, a transatlantic hyperinflation is the knowable outcome of continuing the present trends.
Now, at present, Western and Central Continental Europe is in the process of dying. That is, if the trend and policy trends which are established in the euro area, so-called, in Europe, are allowed to continue, the area will die. These former nations, and I say former nations, Portugal, a former nation, Spain, a former nation, France, a former nation, Germany, a former nation, Italy, a former nation, Greece, a former nation, and so forth. These nations, former nations, are now faced with distress at an unbelievable rate of acceleration of inflation, which is going to cause mass death unless it's stopped. We face a similar situation in the United States, but different. We faced a similar situation in much of the world.
Protests ignited again in Greece last Wednesday as 80,000 protesters rallied outside the Parliament building in Athens, hundreds of them hurling gasoline bombs and chunks of marble at police, as a coalition government narrowly passed another austerity bill worth $17 billion in cuts and tax increases over the next 2 years. Those austerity measures are what has been demanded as the penitence Greece owes to its creditors to make the latest installment of the $240 billion rescue seem worthwhile for holding together the European Monetary Union for another short spell. But wait, shouldn't Greece be prospering? Under the business model, the Greek government is doing everything correctly. They're doing what the Troika demands, and who knows economics better than the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF? Greece is trying to look like a good investment by cutting expenses, bolstering the appearance of the solvency of the euro, and making those tough decisions that will satisfy creditors and increase confidence and normality in the markets. Of course, if the Troika approach and the business theory works, then Greece doesn't have 1/4 of their population unemployed. They're not in their 5th year of depression with no projections of recovery. And the recent IMF projection of a 5 to 10% decrease in Greek life expectancy due to austerity simply isn't true. The theory wouldn't allow it. Now, because of its success in Europe, the United States government is going for the Troika policy. In August of 2011, the U.S. was facing imminent default. The threat of that occurring amidst a rising federal deficit drew in the vultures at the rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Both houses of Congress were warned, if you fail to raise the debt ceiling and cut the federal deficit, U.S. debt will be downgraded. This threat to the security of the United States, delivered by a foreign body, led economist Lyndon LaRouche to call the actions treason to shut down the U.S. government. These agencies are engaged in a conspiracy to shut down the U.S. government. So it happened, the Congress capitulated to the threats of downgrade from the foreign rating agencies and passed the Budget Control Act of 2011, Barack Obama's Enabling Act. The act provided for the raising of the debt ceiling to avert the immediate crisis. It also established an unconstitutional congressional supercommittee comprised of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats tasked to cut $1.5 trillion from the federal deficit by November 2011. If they failed to come to an agreement, those cuts would become automatic by the beginning of 2013, automatically gouging $1.2 trillion from defense and other government spending. November 2011 came and went. The supercommittee could not agree on the austerity measures. And here we are today, at the end of the road, approaching the fiscal cliff, that arbitrary point agreed upon out of the stupidity and corruption of our president and Congress. For most, the initial treason of only 15 months ago has been conveniently forgotten, making way for the latest treason, those automatic budget cuts which will mean mass death in the United States, all for the satisfaction of foreign financial interests. Additionally, when the supercommittee deal was first initiated, a July 2011 hearing of the House Committee on Financial Services revealed that British S&P executive David Beers and Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner had been exchanging a large volume of emails and had been in very regular, frequent contact, many times, over the deficit issue and threats to downgrade. In a July 4th column in the Financial Times, David Beers stated that it would take $4 trillion in cuts and tax increases over the course of a decade for the U.S. to avert a fiscal crisis. Shortly after the publication of that article, ranking figures in the Obama administration, the president himself, as well as members of the Congress began quoting the S&P figure of $4 trillion as the amount needed to be cut from the budget over the course of a decade. Of course, that massive austerity would be unthinkable, actually impossible, unless it was part of a big deal or a grand compromise to gut entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, programs initially promised exemption from the automatic cuts. So with the fiscal cliff looming and $1.2 trillion in cuts being prepared for the American people, the S&P figure was repeated just this past week by the newly re-elected President Barack Obama.
Now, already I've put forward a detailed plan that allows us to make these investments while reducing our deficit by $4 trillion over the next decade. I want to be clear, I'm not wedded to every detail of my plan. I'm open to compromise. I'm open to new ideas. I'm committed to solving our fiscal challenges. But I refuse to accept any approach that isn't balanced. I am not going to ask students and seniors and middle-class families to pay down the entire deficit while people like me making over $250,000 aren't asked to pay a dime more in taxes. I'm not going to do that.
What took place in Germany in 1923 was the rule, not the exception, of how a hyperinflationary crash occurs, with a collapse in production, on top of a mounting deficit and massive austerity. The foreign demand that the debt be paid down had no relation to the continued existence of the nation, but it was honored. Today, there is no imminent military threat facing the United States if we were to cancel those debt obligations that could only be paid through radical austerity. With the presidential elections now finally over, there's a renewed momentum for reinstating a Glass-Steagall firewall between our nation's true obligations and those obligations imposed upon us artificially. There's an incoming freshman class in the Congress with a faction which was elected explicitly on the platform of restoring Glass-Steagall. That is the current best option and the first requirement for saving the nation. Stay tuned to LaRouchePAC.com. Thank you.